For my data analysis video, I looked at some data from a survey that I gave my students at the end of my class last semester. The research question that I'm answering in this data analysis is which genres of books should I have more of in my classroom library to match the genres that my students enjoy reading? But before I get to that question, I wanted to look at a few of the other questions from my class survey. One thing I noticed is that only 74 students took the survey, although I had about 100 students last semester. So about 25 students didn't take the survey at all. Part of that is because I give the survey on the last day of class and a lot of students are absent that day. But also, I've noticed that a lot of students that just really didn't like my class at all refused to take the survey. And I think that is important to notice because it can mean that some of the data is skewed. On the survey, I asked several questions about whether or not my students felt like they've improved at different categories after taking my class. And this is an example of one where the majority of students who responded to the survey felt like they had improved. On these questions, the students were rating themselves on a scale from 1 to 5, where 1 meant not at all and 5 meant definitely. And so again, here you can see that the majority of students felt like they had improved as writers after taking my class. I realized looking at this category that it might have been helpful to have my students take a survey at the beginning of the semester so that I could compare it to this end of year survey. Although fewer students felt like they improved at poetry after taking my class, without the preliminary data to compare it to, I don't know if that means that they don't feel like they improved or if they just don't feel like they improved as much. One last thing that I found interesting when looking at these questions on the survey was that about 20 students did not feel like they improved in each of the categories for poetry, writing, and speaking. But only 8 students felt like they didn't improve at understanding the choices that writers make, which made me really happy because that's something that I've worked hard at to improve my teaching skills. Now to my question, which genres of books should I have more of in my classroom library to match the genres that my students enjoy reading? To be able to answer my research question, I'm looking at the question from the survey that asked students, what is a book you enjoyed reading that you think I should add to my classroom library? I started by looking at the books in my classroom library and dividing them into fiction versus nonfiction. I definitely have a lot more fiction than nonfiction in my classroom library. Then I divided the student suggestions for books into fiction versus nonfiction. The data seems to indicate that, like me, my students prefer fiction to nonfiction. I also highlighted in yellow some of the books that they suggested that I already have in my classroom library, just so that I could see and know, but I didn't delete them from my table because of the research question that I'm looking at. Next, I divided the nonfiction books in my classroom library into categories. The categories that I ended up with were true stories, graphic nonfiction, psychology and sociology books, and other, with true stories like narrative nonfiction, memoirs, biographies being the biggest category. Next, I divided the student suggestions for nonfiction into categories. I divided the student suggestions for nonfiction into true stories, psychology, sociology, and other so that it matched the categories from my own books. But I noticed that all 3 of the books in the other category are actually environmentally related books. Last, I divided the fictional books in my classroom library into categories. The categories I ended up with for my fiction books were sci-fi, fantasy, and dystopia, contemporary, historical, classic literature, graphic novels, mystery, and poetry style. After dividing my fiction books into these categories, I can tell that I have mostly contemporary fiction by far. I also have quite a few sci-fi, fantasy, and dystopia novels, and quite a few classic literature. I divided my student suggestions for fiction into the same categories to be able to compare. I was surprised to see that my students suggested so many sci-fi, fantasy, dystopia novels. I knew that that was a popular category, but I still expected the contemporary category to be bigger than that category. I was also interested to see that many students recommended mystery novels, which is a category that I don't have a lot of in my class. I only had 3 books that fit in that category in my classroom library. After organizing the data, I went back to my question: which genres of books should I have more of in my classroom library to match the genres that my students enjoy reading? When I compared the simplest categories, fiction versus nonfiction, I found that, like me, most of my students prefer fiction. Of the students that suggested nonfiction books, most prefer true stories, but a few are interested in environmental issues, and I don't have any books in that genre in my classroom library currently. In fiction, I did have a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, but I had way more contemporary fiction. Based on my students' suggestions, I should add more fantasy and sci-fi to my classroom library. Although only 6 students suggested mystery books, I only have 3 mystery books in my current classroom library, so there is an imbalance there. That might mean that I need to add more mystery books to my library, or it might also mean that I just need to collect more data about how students feel about that genre.